Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we're going over Erec and Enide again, so we're covering the last half of the story. So if you haven't already listened to the first part with the previous podcast, then you really need to do that in order to appreciate what's going on here, because there's a lot of details and a lot of context that I talk about in the first half, which is really important. So go watch that if you haven't already, and then come back to this one. All right, so in the story, we've been following Erec and Enide, who had just gotten married, right? And then they run into some marital issues, if you remember, because Erec was spending so much time with his wife. You know, he wasn't going jousting, he wasn't, fighting, he wasn't going outside the court at all. He was just kind of, locked in his room, essentially. And he sort of gains like a bad reputation amongst his knights and amongst the people in his land. His wife hears of it, and then she's very distraught about this. Erec finds out. And then Erec takes his wife and no one else, just them two, and they go traveling. They just set out. We're not really told where they're going, and it kind of seems like Erec doesn't know where he wants to go either. So they're running around, and they're constantly running into trouble. Various knights try to attack them. People try to, take his wife from him, things like that. But the latest trouble they had just escaped, and this was at the end of part 1, so just catching us up a bit, was that Erec fought against Kibbler the Short, who was like a powerful lord. Erec eventually wins, although he does take a lot of injuries. And then Kibbler says that he could follow him and help him out, but Erec says no. Rather, he wants to make Kibbler swear an oath that if he ever hears that Erec is in trouble, that he will come to his help. And then Kibbler agrees to this. And it's also important to note that Erec also denies any medical attention. Kibbler says, I have doctors in a castle nearby and they can heal you up. And he refuses that. Another thing that's going on in the story as of now is that when Erec and Enide were writing, Erec always told Enide to not speak to him, no matter what. But then the sort of pattern that repeats a few times is that Erec is in deep thought. He's not really paying attention to what's around him. However, Enide sees some sort of danger coming, some sort of knight attacking them or approaching them on horseback or whatever. And then Enide has this sort of internal dialogue with herself saying, well, I want to save my lord. I love him, all that. However, he did tell me to be quiet. However, he might die if I don't tell him. And then eventually each time she ends up speaking to save him. And then Erec normally gives some sort of rebuke saying, why did you do that or whatever? But then Erec goes and deals with the situation. And this happened again with the story with Kibbler, fighting against Kibbler. However, it has a little bit of a different twist at the end. So even though Enide, speaks out when she's not supposed to, Erec rebukes her. The poem then says, though, that Erec perceived full well that Enide loved him, and he loved her with all his might. So it seems like, in a sense, their marriage, which was at a sort of low point, once they left their castle, is now slowly being restored. And in between recording this and the last episode, I've been thinking a little bit about why Erec tells his wife to be silent. I think I speculated a little bit in the last episode, but one way to look at it, I don't know if this is the correct way, but at least it is a way to look at it that might be helpful. If we go back to the Bible, one of the things that we can see throughout is this notion that with regards to, let's say sacrifice or various rules and laws that God gives, the purpose of those rules and laws isn't just to blindly do them. It's no good if you give sacrifices but aren't going to try to change your life to be more holy. There's a higher purpose in which these commandments point to rather than just to follow them blindly. And I think this might be what's going on with Erec telling his wife to be silent. At one hand, you have Enide, who is supposed to, listen to her husband and obey him. However, she's going against, what he wants, and she is speaking out. but she's doing it to save him. You could tell that it's out of a sense of love. It's not out of a sense of disobedience. It's out of a sense of love. And the poem is very explicit about that. And then Erec finally realizes this too. Even though Erec is, a husband, he's a knight, he's a very powerful nobleman, even for him, there's a higher law in which he has to follow. So those are just some thoughts on that. So let's continue with the story though. So after he leaves Kibbler, after Erec leaves the fight with Kibbler, he's very badly wounded, he refuses help, but then they keep going on their journey, him and Enide, and then they run into King Arthur in his court, and they had set up camp where they were, or nearby where they were, to do some hunting. And then Kay, or Seneschal Kay, who is kind of like the household manager of King Arthur's court, you could say, he's also a knight, sometimes called Sir Kay in some Arthurian legends. So this Sir Kay, he sees Erec and Enide in the vicinity, and then he goes up to them and approaches them. But he does everything in a very disgraceful way. Like, he takes Sir Gawain's horse to go up to them rather than taking his own. And then he tries to literally drag Erec by his horse's reins to Arthur's court. Erec, after protesting, finally gets really annoyed, and then they start fighting. And Erec knocks Kay off his horse, and then Kay goes back running to tell what happened to King Arthur. And it should be noted here that Erec is unrecognizable at this point because his armor is so badly damaged that all the heraldic marks, the blasons, they're so damaged that they're unrecognizable. So in some sense, Erec at this point as a knight really has no identity. He's just like an abstract idea of a knight or like a lord, but there's no real identity to him. So anyways, Kay goes back to court and tells Arthur what happened. And then Arthur tells Gawain. So remember, Gawain is considered the best of all knights. We were told in the first part that Erec is the greatest of all knights. However, he's second only to Gawain, who is the greatest of all the knights. So Gawain rides off to Erec and Enide with two of his squires, trying to get Erec and Enide to, come back to court and say hi, so to speak. He asks very nicely for them to join the king and queen, but Erec refuses. So Gawain pulls a very clever trick. He whispers to one of the squires he brought with him to go to King Arthur and tell him to move up his camp. And then he will delay Erec and Enide by talking to them for so long that by the time they get moving and they're able to move a little bit of distance, it will be nightfall, and then they will reach Arthur's camp, and then they'll essentially be forced to lodge with them. And this is exactly what happens. He delays them long enough, they get going, but by the time night falls, because the camp had been moved up, they basically are back in the camp at nightfall, so they got to stay with them. So eventually Erec meets the king and queen, and everyone realizes who everyone else is. And while the Arthurian court is very pleased to have run into Erec, he's a little bit mad. He kind of wants to just get going. But they notice that Erec is very sickly. They notice he's very pale and he's obviously wounded. And I'll read from the poem. It says, "Right there on the spot, they removed Erec's armor. And when they saw his wounds, their joy turned to anger. The king sighed deeply, then had an ointment brought which his sister Morgan had made. The ointment that Morgan had given Arthur was so wonderfully effective that the wound to which it was applied, whether on nerve or joint, could not fail to be completely cured and healed within a week, provided, and this is important, provided it was treated with the ointment once a day. They brought the ointment to the king, and it brought great relief to Erec." But then Erec tells Arthur, he says, "Sire, I have no wound from which I am suffering so much that I want to interrupt my journey. No one could detain me. Tomorrow I shall tarry no more. I want to leave in the morning when I see the day dawning." At this the king shook his head and said, "There is something very wrong here if you do not wish to stay. I know full well that you are in great pain. If you want to act sensibly, then stay, for it will be a great loss if you die in this forest. Dear good friend, do stay until you are recovered." Erec replied, "That is enough. I am resolved in this matter and would not delay for anything." So they sleep, and then they rise in the morning, and then they head off. And again, he refuses to take anyone but his wife. And since he's not applying the cream weekly and recovering, he's actually not going to be healed. One way to view this is to look at the Arthurian court as civilization in a sense, and that in order for Erec to heal from being, in the wilderness, in exile for so long, he needs to stay in civilization for at least enough time so that the cream or the ointment and the healing can take place. But this isn't to say that civilization is perfect, right? Because if you remember, the person who's sort of the head of the household in a sense is Sir Kay, who kind of represents everything that can go wrong with knighthood. Very brash, not courteous, just an excess of like masculinity, you could say, or like an excess of violence. This is especially true in Percival in the story of the Grail, where Kay also appears, and he also kind of has this role as this sort of brash knight who disrupts the court. But anyways, moving on, Erec and Enide go out again on their little adventure to, wherever Erec has in mind. So while they're traveling, Erec hears the cry of a damsel. And it's important to note that this is actually the first time where danger occurs, and it's Erec who perceives it, rather than his wife who tells him. So Erec hears this cry of this damsel, and then eventually he finds her and he asks her what's wrong. And then she tells him that her lord has been captured by these giants. The lady tells Erec, "My lord, it is no wonder that I show grief, for I wish that I were dead. I neither love nor value my life, for my beloved has been taken prisoner by two evil and cruel giants, who are his mortal enemies. God, what shall I do, wretch that I am, for the best knight alive, the noblest and the most generous? Now he is in the grip of mortal danger. Today they will treacherously make him suffer an ignoble death. Noble knight, I pray you, for God's sake, to assist my beloved. If ever you can assist him, you will not need to go far. They are still very near here." Erec, of course, accepts, and then he goes to hunt down the giants. He eventually finds the knight and the giants, and this is the description we're given. "He saw the unclad knight, barefoot and naked, upon a draught horse, bound hand and foot as if he had been caught committing larceny. The giants had neither spears, shields, sharpened swords, nor lances. Instead, they had clubs, and both held whips." And now, if you remember from the first part, there was a certain evil dwarf who held a whip. So Erec charges after the giants, and he eventually kills them, but they do give Erec quite a good smacking before Erec is able to slay them. So Erec was wounded beforehand, now he's even more wounded. So he reunites the couple together, and they thank him, of course, and then they ask him for his name. And Erec actually refuses to say his name, so this is the first time, I believe, where someone asks his name and he refuses to give it. He says that if they want to learn his name, then he should go to King Arthur's court in his camp nearby and say what happened, and then they will learn his name. And then that couple runs off and they go and do that. Meanwhile, though, Erec is really not in good shape. The poem says, "Erec meanwhile rode on a great pace back to where Enide was waiting for him. She had felt great sorrow meanwhile, for she believed without a doubt that he had quite abandoned her, and he in turn was very fearful that someone who would have made her do his will might have led her away, and so he hastened to return. But the heat of the day and his armor made him suffer so that his wounds reopened, and all of his dressings came apart. His wounds never stopped bleeding as he came straight to the place where Enide was waiting for him. She saw him and was delighted, but she was unaware of the pain he suffered, for his whole body was bathed in blood, and his heart was failing him. As he was coming down a knoll, he suddenly collapsed over the neck of his horse. As he tried to get up again, he toppled from the saddle and fell unconscious, as though dead. Then began great sorrowing. When Enide saw him fall, the fact that she was alive gave her great pain, and she ran towards him, making no attempt to hide her grief. She cried aloud and wrung her hands upon her breast. No portion of her clothes remained unrent. She began to tear her hair and to rend her tender face. "O God," she said, "fair sweet Lord, why do you let me live so long? Death, come and kill me, get on with it." With these words, she fainted upon the body. When she revived, she blamed herself severely. "Ah," she said, "woeful Enide, I am the murderess of my lord. I have killed him by my folly. My lord would still be alive if I, like one both rash and mad, had not spoken the words that caused my lord to come here. A great silence never harmed anyone, but speaking often causes harm. I have truly found this out by experience in many ways." So Erec from his wounds just collapses and it seems like he's dead. And then Enide is saying that she actually caused this because the words that she spoke about, Eric's bad reputation, which caused this whole chain of events to begin in the first place. And then, so Enide keeps mourning, she keeps lamenting, and then finally it says, she drew the sword from the scabbard and began to look at it. God, who is full of mercy, caused her to delay. While she was recalling her sorrow and misfortune, there came at great speed a count with a great troop of knights, who from afar had heard the lady crying aloud. God did not wish to abandon her, for she would have killed herself at once had they not surprised her, taken the sword from her, and driven it back into the scabbard. So her grief was so much that she tried to kill herself, right? But then a count with some of his knights, and by the way, this is a different count than from the one we encountered in the last podcast. So this is a different count with his knights who come and they startle her, and thankfully they prevent her from killing herself. They then ask her what's wrong, and she kind of explains the situation. And then the count gets down and he tries to console her. But then he says that he will marry her. Enide starts to protest, but he just kind of ignores her. So they take Enide and Eric's body back to the count's castle. The poem then reads, all the people followed after them, ladies, knights, and burghers. In the middle of the great hall, on a table, they placed Eric's body and laid it out, his shield and lance beside him. The hall filled up, the crowd thronged. Everyone was pushing to inquire what grief this was and what was the source of wonder. Meanwhile, the count conferred privately with his barons. Lords, he said, I wish to wed this lady without delay. We can easily see, from both her beauty and her manner, that she is of very noble lineage. Her beauty and her nobility show that the honor of a kingdom or of an entire empire would be well vested in her. I shall never be lessened through her. Rather, I think to better myself. Have my chaplain summoned, and you, bring the lady. I wish to give her half of all my land as a dowry, if she consents to do my will. Then they summoned the chaplain, just as the count had ordered, and then they brought the lady and gave her by force to the count, though she vigorously refused him. Nonetheless, the count married her, since such was his desire, and when he had married her, the constable immediately had the table set in the palace and the food prepared, for it was already time for the evening meal. So the count forcefully marries Enide, and then they begin to feast, like having like a wedding feast as you would, but it's kind of weird because Eric's body is just laying on the table. And Enide tells the count that she will not eat until she sees Eric, her lord, eat first. And then this causes the count to slap her. And it's such a faux pas that even the count's barons rebuke him, and they say, you should be deeply ashamed for striking this lady for not eating. You have committed a very great villainy. If this lady laments for her lord, whom she sees dead, no one should say she is wrong. And then the count says that this lady is mine, and I am hers, and I shall do with her as I will. And then Enide responds and tells the count that she will never be hers. The count then strikes her again, and then Enide says that she is not scared of his threats. She says, I don't care what you say or do to me. I fear neither your blows nor your threats. Beat me, strike me, go ahead. I'll never find you so fearsome that I'll do anything more or less for you, even if right now, with your own hands, you were to tear out my eyes or skin me alive. And then we're told, in the midst of these words and cries, Eric regained consciousness, like a man who awakes from sleep. If he was astonished at the people he saw around him, it was no wonder, but he felt deep grief and anguish when he heard his wife's voice. He came down from the table and quickly drew his sword. Wrath and the love he bore for his wife made him bold. He ran towards where he saw her and struck the count on top of the head, so that he sliced through his brains and brow. Without challenge and without a word, the blood and brains spilled out. So as you can imagine, since Eric just seemingly came back from the dead and just sliced the count's head, people are understandably a little bit freaked out and they start screaming and running out of the castle, and they think like a ghost has come to haunt them. But Enide is not freaked out by this. In fact, they embrace, and then Eric tells her, My sweet love, I have tested you in every way. Don't be dismayed anymore, for now I love you more than ever I did, and I am once more certain and convinced that you love me completely. Now, I want to be henceforth just as I was before, entirely at your command, and if your words offended me, I fully pardon and forgive you for both the deed and the word. Then he kissed and embraced her anew. Now Enide suffered no more as her lord embraced and kissed her and reassured her of his love. Through the night they rode swiftly on, and it gave them much comfort that the moon shone brightly upon them. So the poem isn't exactly clear whether or not Erec really died or was just in some sort of like coma state or just unconscious or whatever, but I don't think the physical aspect matters too much. I think what's more important here is that there's a sort of symbolism going on of somebody dying and then rising from the dead. And with Erec's rising from the dead, he has a renewed love towards Enide, and in a sense, their marriage is now saved. It is now whole or complete. However, it should be stated that Erec is still very wounded. He's still very weak, and although in some sense he is resurrected, it's not necessarily like a full body restoration. The poem tells us then that the news traveled quickly, for nothing else is so swift. So specifically, the news that traveled so quickly was the fact that the Count kind of married a woman against her will, and Kibbler hears of this. And if you remember, the promise that Kibbler made to Erec upon his defeat was that if he ever hears of Erec being in distress, that he will come and save him. So when Kibbler hears the news, he realizes who the people are, and he realizes that the Count is marrying Enide against her will. So he takes a bunch of his knights and his men in arms, and he goes to siege the castle where the Count is at. So while Erec and Enide are leaving, Kibbler and his men are coming to siege the castle, and in fact, while they're leaving, Kibbler and Erec end up fighting each other without really realizing who the other person is. And then they fight, but this time, instead of Erec winning, it's actually Kibbler who wins, but then they quickly realize, who they are, and, all is forgiven. And then Kibbler tells them, he says, "My lord, I have a castle near here that is well situated and in a fine place. For your comfort and benefit, I wish to take you there tomorrow, and we shall have your wounds taken care of. I have 2 charming and cheerful sisters who know much about healing wounds. They will heal you well and speedily. We will have our troops spend the rest of the night amid these fields, because a bit of rest, I believe, will do you so much good this night. I suggest that we take shelter here." And then Erec responds that I too advise this. So this is a pretty big shift in Erec's character, because normally he had always been, denying hospitality, saying that he needs to go somewhere, and kind of just wanting to go alone with his wife. However, this time, he's willing to accept hospitality from somebody else. So he has restored his marriage, and now he's able to heal himself in a physical sense, but also he's able to, we could say, heal himself with the rest of the world. He no longer feels the need to just isolate himself. And if we go back to the reason why Erec sort of went out on this journey to begin with, it was because, in a sense, he had isolated himself with his wife. But now his marriage is fixed. Both Erec and Enide, express their love towards each other, and there's no sort of malice towards each other. And now Erec is able to open up his life a little bit, you could say, and he can reintegrate into society. And now I want to point out the little parallel that Chrétien has set up here. So if you remember from part 1, there's a sort of similar story that happens where they meet a count, and then the count tries to marry Enide. And then as they're leaving, or a little bit after they leave, they encounter Kibbler, and then Erec beats Kibbler. However, this time there's a similar thing going on, right? Where there's a count who tries to, I guess, in some sense, technically does, although there probably wasn't any sort of consummation, so the marriage wasn't valid. But, a count tries to marry Enide, and then as they're leaving, they encounter Kibbler once again. And then there's also a chiastic structure as well I want to point out. So just a quick refresher on what a chiastic structure is. It's when you have the very beginning and the very end relate to each other in some way, and then the second thing, and then the second to last thing relate to each other, and then so on and so forth. And then there's some culmination or peak that's in the middle. So it starts with Erec leaving the court of Arthur still injured, although he did get a little bit of healing from Arthur's sister, but, again, because he didn't do the full treatment, he wasn't fully healed. And then this is related to when he goes to Kibbler's castle, and then Kibbler's sisters heal him. So both of these have to deal with, being in the court of another person and accepting help. And it's interesting that in both cases, it's the sisters of the person who hosts the court who applies the healing. And now moving in, right after Erec leaves the court of Arthur, he fights the giants. And then this is related to after he leaves the count or runs away from the count in the castle, he fights Kibbler. And the reason why these are related is because there's the giants, but then we have to remember that Kibbler is a dwarf. So they're both these sort of creatures on the edge, you could say. The giant and the dwarf are really related to each other. And in one instance, in the first part, we talked about how there was a giant who had a brother who was a dwarf. And now in the next layer, we have Erec dying or becoming unconscious, we could say. And then we have his resurrection and the killing of the Count. And then in the middle, we have the Count forcefully marrying Enide, or at least doing the ceremony to marry. So going back to the story, Erec gets healed up at Kibbler's castle, his sisters heal him, and then a little detail that's added is that the sisters, they remove Erec's dead flesh. And you can see this as symbolic of Erec, kind of moving up the hierarchy, moving up the ladder of divine ascent. He's shedding off the old man, and he's just keeping what's good. And then it's also added that once Erec is fully healed up, Kibbler gives him these new, very expensive and elegant garments, which further adds to that symbolism of, having a new life, becoming a new man, or kind of, overcoming adversity and becoming stronger from it. And now with Erec fully healed, he says that he wants to go back to his own land now. And this is interesting for a few reasons, right? So in several instances, we saw that Erec wants to leave the court of other people, leave people's castles or whatever, because he says that he has somewhere to go, right? However, now he's kind of making an about face and he's saying, I just want to go home now. And this puts into question about why did Erec originally leave? Where did he intend to go? But I don't really think that there was a specific place, per se, that Erec had in mind. It seems more so to be a form of self-imposed exile, and he's only able to make his way back home once he has, in some sense, fixed some of the problems with himself and, with his marriage. The other interesting thing that Erec says is that not only does he want to go home, he also wants to go back to Arthur's court as well. And Kibbler offers to go with him and to bring along, their servants and their knights and squires. And again, Erec agrees to this as well. And then as they're getting ready in the morning, the poem makes a note about how Enide gets ready very quickly. And this is contrasted to when Erec and Enide set off originally on their little self-imposed exile, where the poem makes a big point about how Enide took a long time to get ready and purposely delayed. Another interesting bit here is that since they had lost their horses, they give Enide a new horse to ride on. And then the poem goes into a bit of description about this horse. It says, the head coloring was unique. It was divided in such a way that it had one cheek completely white and the other as black as a crow. Between the two, there was a line, greener than a vine leaf, that separated the black from the white. The workmanship, I can tell you truly, of the bridle and of the breast strap and the saddle was fine and beautiful. The entire breast strap and the bridle were full of emeralds. The saddle was made in another way, covered with expensive cloth. The saddle bows were of ivory, and carved upon them was the story of how Aeneas came from Troy, how in Carthage, with great joy, Dido received him in her bed, how Aeneas betrayed her, how she killed herself because of him, and how Aeneas later conquered Laurentum and all of Lombardy, where he was king for the rest of his life. So when it comes to the horse's head, right, so it's one side is white, one side is black, and then it has the dividing line that's green. I'm not too sure what to make of that, honestly. One proposal I've seen is that there was a medieval color theory that was floating around at this time that Chrétien might have had access to that said black and white are opposites, but that green is the middle color, and that the horse is supposed to represent a sort of new, well-ordered life that they're living now. I don't know if I completely buy that. However, it's kind of the best that I have, honestly. And then the other detail that we're given is the saddle that's, beautifully engraved with the story of Aeneas and how he came from Troy. So this might be a reference, well, obviously it's a reference to the Aeneid. However, this also could be a sort of reference to Chrétien's name, right? So he's known as Chrétien de Troyes, which just means Chrétien from Troy, or if you want to translate Chrétien, it means Christian from Troy. And there's a city in France where Chrétien probably comes from called Troyes, which from a sort of secular history standpoint, the city really isn't related to Troy and the name doesn't even come from it. However, he seems to be tapping into the fact that they have similar names, at least on a surface level. And I don't really put this past him because throughout his works, There's a few times where he does a little bit of wordplay with his name Chrétien and sort of juxtaposing it to the word Christian. It could also be the case that the story that he's describing, the specific scenes from the Aeneid, he views as relevant to the story that he's writing here. So Erec and his crew go out and they encounter this town. And Kibbler tells them that it's the town of Brandeggen and that it's ruled by King Evrain. And Erec is admiring the town and the fortress that's there and all the wealth that's there. "My lord," he said with deep concern, "if you don't mind, let us not stay there. There is a very evil ritual in this town." "Evil?" said Erec. "Do you know what it is? Whatever it is, tell us, for I should like to know about it." "My lord," he said, "I would be afraid that you would have suffered harm from it. I know that in your heart there is so much courage and much goodness that, if I told you what I know of the adventure, which is very dangerous and difficult, you would want to go there. I have often heard tell of it, for 7 years or more have passed since anyone who went there to seek the adventure returned from the town, and yet bold and courageous knights from many lands have come. My lord, do not consider this a game, for you will never learn of it from me until you have pledged by the love you have promised me that you will never seek the adventure from which none escapes without receiving shame and death." But Erec insists and he begs Kibbler to tell him about the town. And then Kibbler acquiesces and he says, "I cannot keep silent and avoid saying what you wish to hear. The name is beautiful to speak, but it is painful to achieve, for no one can escape from it alive. The adventure, I must assure you, is called the Joy of the Court." And this does nothing but just to excite Erec to adventure even more. So they go into the town, and then this is the description that we read as they enter the town. "The people who had gathered along the street in great crowds saw Erec, who was so handsome that judging from appearance, they thought all the others were in his service. Everyone looked at him with admiration. The whole town was astir with rumors, such was the muttering and talking of the people. Even the maidens dancing their rounds left off their singing or postponed it. All of them, together, looked at him and crossed themselves for his great beauty. Aghast, they pitied him. 'O God,' said one to the other, 'alas, this knight who is passing by is coming to the joy of the court. He will suffer from it before he leaves. No one ever came from another land to seek the joy of the court without meeting with shame and loss, and forfeiting his head there.' But eventually they make their way up to the fortress, and they're received by King Evrain. And Evrain is said to be a very noble king. Chrétien goes out of his way to note that King Evrain greeted Enide with much honor and courtesy, and he says that he had no base or foolish thought in himself. So, right, this is important because the last two, counts that they encountered, wanted to marry Enide for lustful purposes. So they dine that evening with King Evrain, and then while they're eating, Erec brings up the joy of the court and he inquires about it further. Then the king responds to him and says, "Truly, dear friend, I hear you wasting your words. This is a most sorrowful subject, for it has brought suffering to many a good man. You yourself in the end will be wounded and killed by it, if you will heed no counsel. But if you were willing to believe me, I would advise you to give up asking for such a painful thing, in which you would never succeed. Speak no more of it, keep silent about it. You would be very unwise not to heed my advice. It is no wonder at all that you seek honor and renown. But if I should see you taken prisoner or physically wounded, I should be very sad at heart. I can guarantee you that I have never seen and welcomed many good men who requested this joy. They never improved their lot in any way, but rather all died and perished there. Before evening falls tomorrow, you may expect a similar fate if you insist upon the joy, for you will have it, but at great cost. It is a thing that you ought to renounce and withdraw from, if you want to act in your own interest. That is not why I am telling you that I would betray you and do you wrong if I do not tell you the whole truth." And then Erec realizes that, the king is speaking truthfully and nobly, but then he responds to him. He says, "My lord, I am able to say that I find you upright, noble, and true. I can place no blame on you for what I wish to undertake, however it may evolve for me. Let the matter be decided here and now, for once I have undertaken a thing, I will never commit such an act of recreance by doing anything less than my utmost before fleeing from the field of combat." And then King Evrain reluctantly agrees and says he will take him out in the morning. So they arise in the morning, and then they go out to the joy of the court. And as they're leaving the town, there's all these people who are jeering at them. People saying things like, last night you have been betrayed by the very joy you planned to achieve, when in fact you are going to your death and sorrow. And then another one says, woe to you, fair, noble, and upright knight. Surely it would not be right for your life to end so soon, for any misfortune to befall you, to wound or dishonor you. But regardless, they keep pressing on. And then Chrétien writes, the king led him out of the town and into a nearby garden, and all the people followed, praying that God might let him emerge with joy from this urgent need. But it is not proper to pass on, though the tongue may be worn and weary, without telling you the truth about the garden according to the story. Around the garden, the only wall or palisade was one of air. Yet, by black magic, the garden was enclosed on all sides, with air as though it were ringed with iron, so that nothing could enter except at one single place. And there were flowers and ripe fruit all summer and all winter. And the fruit had the peculiar property that although it could be eaten therein, it could not be carried out. Anyone who tried to take some away could never discover how to get out again, for he could not discover the exit until he put the fruit back in its place. And there is under heaven no bird, however pleasing its song and its ability to gladden and delight a man, that could not be heard therein. And there were several of each sort. And the earth, however great its extent, bears no spice or medicinal plant of use in any remedy that was not planted therein, and there are plenty of them. So we have this garden that's enclosed by air, and as Chrétien says, it has a sort of black magic spell on it, where you can only enter through one passageway. And there's fruit in this garden. You can eat the fruit there, but if you want to leave the garden, you can't take any of the fruit with you. And now I'll read a little bit more of the description. It says, through the narrow entryway, the crowd of people entered. First, the king and then all the others. Erec rode along through the garden, his lance featured, delighting in the singing of the birds therein, emblematic of that joy to which he most aspired. But he saw an astonishing thing that could frighten the boldest warrior of all those we know, be it Thobod the Slav, or Ospinel, or Frungal. In front of them, sharpened on stakes, there were bright and shining helmets, and beneath each circlet he saw a skull appear. But at the end of the row of stakes, he saw one where there was nothing yet, apart from a horn. He did not know what this meant, but he was not at all worried, and instead he asked the king, who was beside him on his right, what this might be. And then the king says to him, friend, do you understand the meaning of this thing you see here? You should greatly fear it if you value your well-being, for this one stake set apart, where you see that horn hanging, has for a long time been waiting for a knight. We don't know whether it waits for you or another. Take care that your head is not placed there, for the stake stands for that purpose. I warned you fully of this before you came here. I do not believe you will ever leave here other than dead and dismembered. Now you know this much. The stake awaits your head, and if it comes to be put there, as has been promised since the stake was put in place, another stake will be planted after this one, which will wait until someone else comes along. Of the horn I shall tell you only that no one has ever been able to sound it. Anyone who is able to sound it will establish his renown and his honor above all those of my land, and he will have achieved a deed of such repute that all will come to honor him and will consider him the best among them. Now, there is no more to say of this matter. Have your people withdraw, for the joy will soon come, and I think will make you suffer. So then, everyone stays back, and then Erec rides up alone. And then, eventually, he finds this bed, and on the bed, there's a woman sitting on it. And so Erec, he dismounts and he goes up to sit next to the lady. But then, before he can even talk to her, there's a knight that begins shouting at him. Vassal, vassal, the knight says, you are mad, upon my soul, to go towards my damsel. By my word, you are not so worthy that you should approach her. This very day you will pay most dearly for your folly. By my head, stand back. And then they begin to fight. It's a very long and protracted fight, but eventually Erec gets the best of this knight. And then after the battle and the other knight has submitted to Erec, the knight tells Erec a little bit about why he is there. Now hear who has kept me so long in this garden, as you have ordered. I wish to tell you everything, however much it may pain me. That maiden who is sitting there loved me from childhood, and I loved her. It was a source of pleasure to us both, and our love grew and improved, until she asked a boon of me, without first saying what it was. Who would refuse his lady anything? He is no lover who does not unhesitatingly do whatever pleases his lady, unstingently and neglecting nothing, if ever he can in any way. I promised I would do her will, and when I had promised her this, she still wanted me to swear it on oath. Had she wished for more, I would have done it, but she believed me on my word. I made her a promise, but I did not know what until after I became a knight. King Evrain, whose nephew I am, dubbed me in sight of many gentlemen within this garden where we are. My lady, who is sitting there, immediately invoked my oath and said that I had sworn to her never to leave this place until some knight came along who defeated me in combat. It was right for me to remain rather than break my oath, though I wish I had never sworn it. Since I knew the good in her, and the thing that I held most dear, I could not show any sign that anything displeased me. For if she had noticed it, she would have withdrawn her love, and I did not wish that at any price, no matter what the consequences. Thus my lady thought to keep me for a long duration, since she did not think that any knight would ever come into this garden who could outdo me. Thus she thought to keep me in all the days of my life with her, completely in her power, in prison, and I should have committed a grievous fault in holding back, and not defeating all those that I could overpower. Such a deliverance would have been ignoble. I can inform you in all honesty that I have no friend so dear that I would have held back in any way against him. I have never wearied of bearing arms or fighting. You have seen the helmet of those I have defeated and killed. But the fault is not entirely mine. For anyone willing to see the whole truth, I had to do what I did if I did not want to be false and faithless and disloyal. And then the knight goes on to tell him that the reason it's called the joy of the court is because the day he is liberated, there will be a great joy in King Evrain's court. And then we learn that the name of this knight is Maboagrain. I might be mispronouncing that, but I couldn't find any sort of pronunciation thing anywhere, so sorry about that. And then another detail I forgot to add is that Maboagrain is said to be a foot taller than any other knight, so I think he's supposed to be some sort of giant. So, after he kind of delivers his monologue to Erec and explains to him why he's in the garden and how Erec has now broken the spell, he tells Erec that he needs to blow the horn to signal to people that the joy of the court has come. And then once Erec blows the horn, it says that the news of the happening flew throughout the land. Then nothing could prevent all the people from coming to the court. From all directions they came rushing, some on foot, some swiftly on horseback, for no one waited for anyone else. And those who were in the garden prepared to remove Erec's armor, and everyone tried to outdo one another in singing a song about the joy. The ladies composed a lay, which they called the Lay of Joy, but the lay is little known. So everyone starts partying, everyone is joyous. However, Enide notices that the lady on the bed isn't happy. She isn't rejoicing. In fact, she seems to be crying. So Enide goes over and talks to her and introduces herself. And then they realize that they're cousins. Specifically, the count from the Sparrowhawk town where Enide is from, that count is her uncle, who is that lady on the bed's daughter. And she tells us how she came here, how Maboagrain was a soldier for her father, and then they kind of had a secret love, you could say, and it makes a lot of references to the fact that she was very young. And then they eventually run off together in a sort of secret union, although the poem kind of indicates that they're not really married. It's not explicit per se, but from a lot of the context and subtext, I think it's pretty clear that they're not married. I think the most obvious thing is that after the cousin gives her peace, Enide responds saying, "Dear cousin, Erec married me with my father's full consent, and to the joy of my mother. All of our relatives knew of it and were happy, as they should have been." So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So I think the first thing to notice is that Maboagrain and Enide's cousin, in some sense, are sort of the inverse of Erec and Enide. With Erec and Enide, their issue is that Erec, in a sense, is too much of a lover, we can say. He's not enough of a knight. Whereas in this case, with Maboagrain and the cousin, Maboagrain is too much of a fighter. There's a sort of excess of masculinity, an excess of sort of virility, you could say. In both of these cases, this excess causes problems at their respective courts. So with Erec, because he's not really fulfilling his duty as a king, as a knight, as a ruler, people sort of start rumors and start talking behind his back. And then this is much more explicit in the case of Maboagrain, where it says that a certain joy was lost when Maboagrain was sort of forced by his oath that he made to stay in the garden, and that there will be a great joy that's restored once the spell is broken. And it should be noted that the description of the garden, it's kind of like, in some sense, it's kind of like opposite the Garden of Eden, you could say. Because in the Garden of Eden, the way you leave, or at least the way Adam and Eve leave, or expelled is perhaps a better term, is that they take of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they eat it, and then they're subsequently expelled. Whereas in this garden, you can eat the fruit all you want, however, you can't leave with the fruit. You're not allowed to take the good things from one place and bring them to another place. Rather, the good things have to just stay in one area. They're not allowed to leave. And if you try to go and break the curse, then, somebody like the Maboagre in this case will fight you and probably kill you. So it's rather fitting that Erec, who has, through his journey, sort of learned to properly combine knighthood with marriage, is the one that's able to save Maboagre and his lady, right? So since Erec has already sort of done what he's supposed to do, he's sort of already moved up in life, moved up on the hierarchy. He's able then to save other people who are in a similar position as he was once in. But he's only able to do that after he himself has elevated himself. So there's a big 3-day celebration that happens, and then Erec says that he wants to go on his way on the 4th day. And then Erec, Enide, and Kibbler go off to King Arthur's court. And it's interesting the way that King Arthur's court is described at this point. So it notes that King Arthur had just been bled, which was a form of treatment for disease at the time. And it also says that his court was really small at this time and that it had never been any smaller. So we really get this idea, and this is something we saw even in the very beginning. We get this idea of the decline of King Arthur and his court, especially compared to his father, Uther Pendragon. Right, so if you remember in the very beginning with the stag hunt, King Arthur says he wants to revive an old tradition. But then Gawain, his nephew, who's the most valiant of all the knights, who's considered the best knight, he says, no, this is very dangerous, because if you do this, you know that the winner has to give a kiss to the most beautiful lady at court, and this is going to cause all sorts of problems, because each person is going to say that his lady or this lady is the most beautiful. But Arthur kind of, doesn't take his advice into consideration. And then you had Erec, who is doing a more, I guess you could say, a silent protest. Although he doesn't, speak out against the stag hunt or anything, he doesn't get himself involved with it. He kind of stays back with the queen. And then Gawain's words come true, right? So once Arthur gets the stag, he has to give a kiss to the most beautiful lady, and the court ruptures into almost violence. And it's only calmed down because the queen says, hey guys, let's wait until Erec comes back. And it just so happens that Erec is coming back with the most beautiful woman who everyone agrees is the most beautiful woman. And then that can resolve the whole beauty issue. This is not really a sign of a healthy court. This is the sign of, the way I would put it would be that Arthur is trying to revive these traditions, but he's just doing it for the sake of reviving the tradition, and he's forgetting perhaps the reason why the hunt for the stag went away. And Arthur is very concerned about people staying at his court. He's constantly imploring Erec to stay at his court. And then when they receive the prisoner from that Erec brought from the Sparrowhawk incident, the only thing that they impose on him is that he must stay at court. So there's nothing inherently wrong with having a large court. That's healthy and all. However, if he becomes like the court of, we can say, the garden of the joy of the court, where it's this really self-centered, this very circular, self-insulating thing, then it is a bad sign. And we can tell by this passage that, not only is Arthur sick, but his court is very small, that he's having a very hard time of keeping all these pieces together. This is a theme that's also taken up a lot more in Percival and the Story of the Grail, where this notion of the decline of King Arthur's court is also very important. But let's continue with the story. So, Erec, Enide, and Kibbler, they meet Arthur and Queen Genevieve, and then Erec tells them the story of what happened. He kind of relays all the events of what happened. And then Chrétien, he adds in a little something to sort of antagonize us as readers. He says, when the murmur had died down, Erec began his tale. He told the king his adventures, forgetting not one of them. But do you expect me to tell you the reason that made him set out? No, indeed, for you well know the truth of this, and of other things, just as I have disclosed it to you. So, it seems pretty obvious to me that Chrétien is saying that there's more to this story than just a story. There's a larger, or more important perhaps, esoteric meaning. And I think I've been able to at least communicate some of what I think that might be to y'all. However, this text is, although it's very easy to read, finding the meaning and all the weirdness and explaining that can be quite tricky. So, after Erec, relays his adventure to King Arthur then asks Erec to stay. But then Erec says that he will stay for 2 or 3 years. He's not acquiescing to stay an infinite amount of time. So I think Erec, in some sense, has now found a balance between like the importance of solitude, I guess you could say, like when him and his wife go out and it's just them two and Erec's often lost in thought, versus just staying in the court for the sake of staying in the court. So Erec says that he will stay for 2 or 3 years, but not for an indefinite amount of time. And then, so while they're at the court, they get news that Erec's father has passed. And then the poem goes on to describe Erec's mourning and how he kind of did everything the right way. He wasn't too outwardly sad. He gave alms, he attended services. He did all the things that one is supposed to do to have an honorable grieving. And then it says that Erec very wisely reclaimed his lands from his father. And then he asked King Arthur to crown him at his coronation. And of course, King Arthur agrees. And they say that they'll do this at Christmas time. And it's interesting that they do the coronation on Christmas Day, because the 2 famous kings who were also coronated on Christmas were William the Conqueror and Charlemagne. So for the coronation, Arthur invites all of his barons, and Erec invites many people, including his in-laws. And if you remember, his in-laws were very poor when he found them. Like the wife and the daughter had to work in like a factory of some sort, or rather like a workshop. They didn't really have factories per se yet. But then Erec sent them a lot of wealth that they could use to sort of rebuild themselves up. So when they come now for his coronation, it says that they come in very nobly dressed, along with all their sort of like squires and knights and servants. And the poem also talks a lot about the gift giving that was going on. Like it says here, the king was very powerful and generous. He did not give mantles made of serge, nor of rabbit or dark brown wool, but of samite and ermine, of whole miniver and molted silk, bordered with offray, stiff and rough. Alexander, so Alexander the Great, who conquered so much that he subdued the whole world and was so generous and rich, was poor and miserly compared to him. Caesar, the emperor of Rome, and all the kings you hear about in narrative and epic poems did not give so much at a celebration as King Arthur gave the day he crowned Erec. Nor did Caesar and Alexander between them dare to expend as much as was spent at the court. So now we've arrived to like the last few pages here, but Chrétien really just packs in a lot of like symbolic themes here. So let's try to cover a few of them at least. So one of them is that there's this sort of faldstool, which is like normally it's like a chair that the bishop sits on, but I think in this case it's more so something that royalty sit on, at least in a courtly sense. And the faldstool that Arthur gives Erec to sit on, it has these like 4 legs, right? But 2 of the legs are in the form of leopards, and the other 2 are in the form of crocodiles. So this is kind of interesting, right? So we had this notion of leopards before in the first half that we talked about, and I mentioned there how leopards are seen as this sort of a hybrid, right? Even like the name leopard means like Leo as in like lion, and then pard as in a sort of type of a panther. And this is also true in the Old French, the way that the words are mashed up together, it keeps that same meaning. So the leopard is seen as this sort of product of like improper like sexual attraction, so like lust, making this sort of mixture. But then the crocodile is also a form of mixture as well, or the sort of liminal figure, because the crocodile occupies both the land and the sea. So as a reptile, the crocodile is also a form of a hybrid. And in both of these cases, these animals are kind of generally associated with like sins and like the passions. Like I said, the leopard with lust, but the crocodile. So crocodiles are associated with Egypt, and there's all the Old Testament imagery of Egypt as like the land of sin, and all these sorts of things. So I think when he sits on the stool or the chair that has the legs of leopards and crocodiles, I think it's showing that Erec is sort of sitting on top of the passions in the sense that he's ruling over them. He has conquered them, and now they prop him up. It's sort of like he has conquered them, and now they work for him rather than he working for them. And then Arthur also gives Erec this very elegant robe to wear. And the robe is given a very interesting description. So it has these 4 depictions on it, and the text is a little bit unclear if the 4 depictions are depictions of 4 different fairies, each of which represents something, or if there's 4 images on the robe and they were created by 4 fairies, as in like, fairies like sewed the robe together or embroidered the images on. But regardless, it's really the images that I want to talk about here. So there's 4 images on the robe. So there's geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. And it's also important to know that Chrétien says that he gets this, or he learns how to describe the robe from a certain Macrobius. So Macrobius is like this 5th century Latin writer who is most famous for his commentary on Cicero. But he's also famous for a sort of outline of education, I guess you could say, with what's called the trivium, which consists of logic, grammar, and rhetoric. And then you have the quadrivium, which consists of the stuff that was appearing on Erec's robe. So that would be geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. So the trivium is like, it's kind of like your 101. It's kind of like you first have to learn the trivium before you can go into the more advanced material with the quadrivium. So the fact that Erec is given this robe with the quadrivium on it rather than the trivium says that he has sort of mastered the more advanced topics in medieval learning at that time. And I should also note that the other thing that Macrobius is known for with his commentary on Cicero is that's where he outlines the virtues of a king and the virtues of like the philosophers or the thinkers. And then here we have Erec, who is given the crown and this robe with the quadrivium on it. So it seems to be a reference or like an implication that Erec has both the virtues of the philosopher, but also of the king. He's a sort of philosopher king, if you will. And I think we need to go back to the very, very, very beginning of this work, and the little preface that we're given by Chrétien. So Chrétien says, and so does Chrétien de Troyes say that it is reasonable for everyone to think and strive in every way, to speak well and to teach well. And from a tale of adventure, he draws a beautifully ordered composition that clearly proves that a man does not act intelligently if he does not give free rein to his knowledge, for as long as God gives him the grace to do so. So clearly throughout the story, Erec has, in a sense, gained knowledge and used his knowledge, and now it's being manifested in a symbolic form with Arthur giving him this robe with this quadrivium on it. And then with regards to Enide, we see that the queen goes to great lengths to give her new clothes as well. So if you remember in the very beginning, before their marriage, Enide was given new clothes by the queen, and now before the coronation, she is also given new clothes by the queen. So I'll read about the official sort of coronation part. So it says, as soon as they arrived at the palace, so Erec and Enide, King Arthur hurried forth to meet them and nobly seated Enide beside Erec, for he wanted to do her great honor. At once he ordered 2 crowns, both of fine solid gold, to be brought forth from his treasure. As soon as he had pronounced this order, the crowns were brought before him, glowing with carbuncles, for there are 4 of them in each one. The light of the moon is nothing compared to the light the very least of those carbuncles could shed. Because of the light they reflected, all those in the palace were so thoroughly dazzled that for a while they could not see a thing. Even the king was dazzled by it, and yet he greatly rejoiced to see them so bright and beautiful. He had 2 maidens take one of them, and 2 barons hold the other. Then he ordered the bishops and priors and abbots of the religious orders to come forward to anoint the new king according to Christian law. So then it goes into a little bit more description about the coronation ceremony, which is kind of interesting, but we'll wrap up here. So after the ceremony, the bells for mass ring, and everyone floods into the church. And it says there were so many people that most people had to stay outside the church because there was just so many people, there. There just wasn't enough room for everyone. And then after that, there's a huge party, and that's kind of how the story ends. So I hope you learned something from this. I know there's a lot of esoteric stuff going on in here that I wasn't always able to cover in the most thorough way, partly because I myself am still grappling a lot of what's going on in this text. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.